Now we want to take a look at how the nation's schools are performing. The 2024 National Assessment of Educational Progress, also known as the Nation's Report Card, released today. It looks at how 4th and 8th graders nationwide are doing in math and reading. For the country, average reading scores have declined at both grade levels compared to the last report, which came out in 2022. For math, average scores increased for 4th graders since 2022, but there was no significant change for 8th graders. One bright spot, the report found that absenteeism has declined since that last assessment. But how does Wisconsin measure up? Well, we dug into the numbers to compare the average scores from this year to the two previous reports, 2022 and 2019. That was before the pandemic, and experts say that had a profoundly negative impact on the education system. Now, when it comes to mathematics, Wisconsin ranks above the national average in both grades. However, as you can see in the 4th graders here, the scores actually have continuously dropped since 2019. After dropping between 2019 and 2022, 8th graders did go back up. They actually rank as the 3rd best in the country. When it comes to reading, once again, Wisconsin in the yellow above the national averages, but the state's averages have dipped for 3 straight reports. This year's 4th grade scores ranking 23rd in the nation, while 8th graders ranked 14th. The report card also finding that Wisconsin still has the widest black to white opportunity gaps of all states in grades and subjects. This mirrors similar data from the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction detailing the relationship between schools with high percentages of economically disadvantaged students and school performance. In its biennial budget request submitted in November, DPI is seeking to invest $4 billion in funding to Wisconsin's public schools. That proposal from State Superintendent Dr. Jill Underly includes increasing the special education rate to 90% by 2027 to provide universal free school meals to all students, support student mental health needs, improve the workforce by helping schools recruit and retain high-quality teachers, and expand Act 20 to increase literacy and expand career and technical education programming. Dr. Underly saying today that budget request is a defining moment. Quote, the legislature has let public school funding fall behind. We cannot expect to see meaningful improvement for our kids if we continue to invest too little. It's time to make the right choices for the future of our state, and that starts with fully funding our public schools and giving every child the opportunity to succeed, end quote. Brittany Kinzer, one of Underly's opponents in the spring election for state superintendent and a former special education teacher herself, released a statement saying in part today, quote, transparency and urgency are critical to addressing this crisis. That's why I'm running to restore high academic standards with a relentless focus on reading, writing, and math, end quote. Dr. Underly and Kinzer will face off with Sauk Prairie School District Superintendent Jeff Wright. That will be in the statewide primary coming up next month. The top 2 vote getters then will move on to face each other in the nonpartisan election on April 1st.